Hello, eighth graders. I hope you're doing pretty much fine, enjoying this holiday. But in this case, I have the duty with you and for you to help you understand the information that we are supposed to be studying from lesson number 2 in the chapter that we are studying right now. In this case, basically, if we remember, we are in chapter number 8, talking about ancient Greece. We already studied about the geography and the early Greeks, and right now it's time for us to come to study about the government in Athens. Okay, so let's start. Okay, basically, we are going to be trying to focus ourselves in this section about government in Athens into three main ideas. The first one about how aristocrats and tyrants ruled early Athens. We're going to also try to understand how Athens created the world's first democracy, and as the third most important here thing to study is ancient democracy was different than today's modern democracy. What is going to be our big idea to understand? Well, that the people of Athens tried many different forms of government before creating a democracy. There are many interesting terms that you could try to define and understand, study, and learn. In this case, we're going to be trying to work with definitions of the words democracy, aristocrats, oligarchy, citizens, tyrant, and obviously to make sure you get to know who was Pericles. Okay, so let's start talking about the aristocrats and the tyrant's rule. Basically, Greece is the birthplace of democracy, a type of government in which people rule themselves. The word democracy comes from the Greek words meaning the rule of the people. But Greek city-states didn't start as democracies, and not all of them became democratic. Even Athens, the city where democracy was born, began with a different kind of government. In early Athens, kings ruled the city-state. Later, a group of rich landowners, or you can talk of them as aristocrats, they took power. A government in which only a few people have power is called an oligarchy. We have to take on account that the aristocrats basically dominated Athenian society. As the richest men in town, they ran the city's economy. They also served as its general and judges, and common people had little to say in the government. So in the 1600s before Christ, a group of rebels tried to overthrow the aristocrats, but they failed. Possible, the reason of this was because of a result of their attempt. However, somewhere a man named Draco created a new set of law for Athens. These laws were very, very, very harsh. For example, Draco's laws made minor crimes such as loitering punishable by death. The people of Athens thought Draco's laws were too strict. So in the 590s before Christ, a man named Solon created a set of laws that were much less harsh and gave more rights to non-aristocrats. Under Solon's law, all free men living in Athens became citizens. Citizens were people who had the right to participate in government. But his efforts were not enough for the Athenian people. They were ready to end the rule of the aristocracy. Because the Athenians weren't pleased with the rule of the aristocrats, they wanted a new government. In 546 before Christ, a noble named Pisistratus overthrew the oligarchy. He became the ruler of Athens. Pisistratus was called a tyrant, which meant a leader who held power through the use of force. Today, the word tyrant means a ruler who is harsh, but the word had a different meaning in ancient Greece. In fact, Athenian tyrants were usually good leaders. Tyrants were able to stay in power because the people supported them. Pisistratus brought peace and prosperity to the city of Athens. He began new policies meant to unify the city. He created new festivals and built temples and monuments. During his rule, many improvements were made in Athens. After Pisistratus died, his son took over as tyrant. Many aristocrats, however, were unhappy because their power was gone. Some of these aristocrats convinced a rival city-state to attack Athens. As a result of this invasion, the tyrants lost power, and for a short period of time, aristocrats returned to power in Athens. So now let's talk a little bit of Athens creating democracy. On the pictures on this slide, you are able to read two important things. Okay, the first one is a quote that is assigned to Pericles, which is better known as the father of democracy. And in this case, he says, just because you do not take an interest in politics doesn't mean politics won't take an interest in you. So this is a quote in which I really would like you to think about, analyze, and try to understand how this phrase or this quote is still so valid nowadays. And the next one is basically the origin of the word democracy. And it says democracy is a Greek word composed of two parts: demos, which means the people, and kratos, that means rule. So eventually, democracy is the rule of the people. So trying to look at a history close-up, we can say that ancient Athens was the birthplace of democracy, the system of government in which the people ruled themselves. Democracy was perhaps the greatest achievement of ancient Athens. In time, perhaps, it became the Greeks' greatest gift to the world. Around 500 before Christ, a new leader named Cleisthenes gained power in Athens. Although he was a member of one of the most powerful families in Athens, Cleisthenes didn't want aristocrats to run the government. He thought they already had too much influence. By calling on the support of the people, he was able to overthrow the aristocracy once and for all. In its place, he established a completely new form of government. Under Cleisthenes' leadership, Athens developed the first or the world's first democracy. For this reason, he is sometimes called the father of democracy. Under Cleisthenes, all citizens in Athens had the right to participate in the assembly, or gathering of citizens that created the city's laws. The assembly met outdoors on a hillside so that everyone could attend the meetings. During the meetings, people stood before the crowd and gave speeches on political issues. Every citizen had the right to speak his opinion. In fact, the Athenians encouraged people to speak. They loved to hear speeches and debates. After the speeches were over, the assembly voted. Voting was usually done by a show of hands, but sometimes the Athenians used secret ballots. Some important facts that we should be remembering, and this means like learn them, because eventually it is related to nowadays experiences during everyday lives. But in this case, in Athenian democracy, for example, people debated issues in the open air, and these debates were noisy affairs. Okay, eventually, only free male citizens of Athens were members of the assembly with the right to vote. Women, slaves, and foreigners could not participate. The Athenian assembly met on a hill called the Panics, and sometimes more than 6,000 men crowded onto this small hill. Men usually spoke before the assembly to support or to argue against different issues. Persuasive speakers often convinced others to pass laws that they supported. Voting was usually done by a show of hands, but sometimes assembly members wrote their votes on broken pieces of pottery. Then officials collected these pottery pieces and counted the votes. Another important thing to remember is that men in the crowd often argued with the speakers during the assemblies. Like the ancient Greeks, we use right now juries to decide court cases, right? Right? But our modern juries have only 12 people. Well, in this case, talking about, for example, the justice system from the United States. Here in Honduras, things are kind of a little bit different. But eventually, as time passed, citizens gained more power in Athens, and for example, they served on juries to decide court cases. Juries in ancient Athens had anywhere from 200 to 6,000 people, although juries of about 500 people were much more common. Most juries had an odd number of members to prevent ties, obviously. Athens remained a democracy for about 170 years. It reached its height under a brilliant elected leader named Pericles. He led the government from about 460 before Christ until his death in 429 before Christ. Pericles encouraged the Athenians to take pride in their city. He believed that participating in government was just as important as defending Athens in war. To encourage people to participate in government, Pericles began to pay people who served in public offices or on juries. Pericles also encouraged the people of Athens to introduce democracy into other parts of Greece. Eventually, the great age of Athenian democracy came to an end. In the middle 330s before Christ, Athens was conquered by the Macedonians from north of Greece. After the conquest, Athens fell under strong Macedonian influence. Even after being conquered by Macedonia, Athens kept its democratic government, but it was a democracy with very limited powers. The Macedonian king ruled his country like a dictator, a ruler who held all the power, and no one could make any decisions without his approval. In Athens, the assembly still met to make laws, but it had to be very, very careful not to upset the king. The Athenians didn't dare make any drastic changes to their laws without the king's consent. They were not happy with this situation, but they feared the king's powerful army. Before long, though, the Athenians lost even this limited democracy. In the 320s before Christ, a new king took over Greece and ended Athenian democracy, however, forever. Some of the countries nowadays, we can say that they have democratic governments in which the people are supposed to be holding the power. But this modern democracy is very different from the ancient Athenians' democracy. Basically, there are two types of democracies. We have the direct democracy and we have representative democracy. What can we say about direct democracy is that all citizens in Athens could participate directly in the government. We call this a form of government, in this case, in a very direct way, okay? But it is called direct democracy because each person's decision directly affects the outcome of a vote, right? In Athens, citizens gathered together to discuss issues and vote on them. Each person's voted counted and the majority ruled. Obviously, we cannot say that we have a direct democracy here in our country, in Honduras, because it is very difficult, or it will be very difficult for direct democracy to work in our country. It will be, for example, impossible for all the citizens, okay, for all the Honduran people to gather in one place for a debate. Can you imagine that? It will be chaos. So instead, um, we have different types of democracy, right, as forms of government. So we have, and here you can see another type of democracy, in this case, representative democracy. Um, Sometimes we can say that here in Honduras, we have a representative democracy, okay, or a republic. In this system, basically, the citizens elect officials to represent them in the government. You can call them mayors, you can call them what we call here congressmen or congresswomen, como diputados y diputadas, or even the president, right? And these elected people or officials, they can meet to make the country's laws and enforce them, right? So, for example, here we have the National Congress, for example, or we have the three main powers in our country, right? So basically, we as citizens do not vote directly, okay, on every single law that the Congress is trying to pass, but we, or at least it should be like that. We should be able to believe that or trust the people that is taking this decision for our country. Even though the situation in our country, we already know that it's kind of difficult, right? So basically, on this section, we have been learning about the development and decline of democracy in Athens. And basically, you can also learn how Athenian democracy influenced our governments, or maybe on the next section, on section number 3, we will be able to learn about the beliefs and cultures of ancient Greeks and how they affect our culture and our literature today.